Hey, Dr. Kelly Watson here, and today I wanted to talk about games and using games and activities in the classroom as a form of experiential learning and for student benefit. I'm a big fan of games, so I'm going to give you first a little, why games are so good for students, and then I'll even share some games that I have done to just provide you with some examples that hopefully will spark your creativity in thinking of some games that meet your learning objectives. So first of all, why games? Well, there's research that shows that actively engaging your learners with games actually will enhance retention. So it because it's actually shifting them from being the passive recipient of information that's just sitting there, sort of letting you entertain them, they become an active part of the learning. And so that hands-on piece helps them to absorb information and retain it because their attention is stimulated, they're more curious, and they're now invested more emotionally in the topic, which is going to help drive that long-term memory. Secondly, it's a safe place for them to practice. And we know that when you create psychological safety and in the form of game and in the form of play, people get an opportunity to practice and not have those, real repercussions. In a game, you think about even a video game, how often someone dies, right? Well, they don't really die in real life, but they, have multiple lives, and that gives them a chance to fail and then start again. Um, so so it's a great way to give them that safe practice. Third, you're getting immediate feedback. So if you've presented a model in class and you want them to practice it, they're going to be able to practice and then get feedback right away. If they were to take that same model and go into the workplace and have to, experience it in their life or experience a similar situation, it could take them a lot longer. So, and then they may forget that what the model was that you showed them or how to approach the situation. So this gives you an opportunity to have them practice and then get immediate feedback, which is going to accelerate their learning so much faster. It's collaborative, and that is always fun. So they have to learn communication skills and they have to get along with each other. And that is great to support that iterative learning and build their self-awareness. So great for lots of topics. Supports diverse learning styles. If you think about it, when you're playing a game, you're often engaging, physicality, audio, visual, all kinds of cues. You're stimulating the brain because you're having these interactions with other people. So it's really great for that sort of universal design that we've been talking about, making sure that all of your learners, no matter what their learning style, is getting an opportunity to participate in the learning. And then finally, it actually allows you to bridge theory and application. So with games, in some ways it's abstract, but you're taking some kind of theory or whatever, and you're allowing them to practice it and apply it in a scenario that may be similar to the real world, but actually isn't the real world. So it actually helps to make these ideas a little more concrete and relevant. And again, before you actually have to apply it in the real world. So it's kind of transferring learning through the phases of learning and allows you to, get a chance to practice, get a chance to do some hands-on. So those are some of the reasons why games are such a great tool for educators. But now I'm going to just kind of give you some examples of some games that I played. So and some that my colleagues have done as well. So one thing I do right off the top is I play syllabus Jeopardy. So, I walk through the syllabus and most students just sit there and their eyes glaze over and they think, oh, all syllabi are the same. And maybe don't really realize how important, some of the information is. And my goal really is to orient them to the information that's there so that they can find it later if they do have questions. But additionally, it's my opportunity to set the tone for the class and sort of my working guidelines. So for example, I don't allow lateness, and lateness gets docked in terms of points. And to me, I feel like we need to teach students good business hygiene, and students seem to be over the years getting worse at showing up on time. And so it's an opportunity anyway to set my expectations. But so then after I go through that information, I then play Jeopardy, and there are some really good PowerPoint-based simplistic games out there on the internet. And one of them is Jeopardy, and it gives you the shell so you can just populate it with your own information. And it even plays a little Jeopardy theme song, which is great. And so I just fill it with, questions about the syllabus, and I break them into teams, and I have little buzzers, and off we go. And so it's a great way for them to, talk about something that normally is pretty boring, the syllabus, and normally something that they're not really engaged with, and cement that learning by having them recall it in a competitive way. And that competition often sparks a lot more motivation and a lot more interest. And so it tends to, get pretty rowdy. And I do find that when I ask for attention or ask a question later about what happens if you're late, people remember. And I think it has a lot more to do with the syllabus Jeopardy than it does just having it printed in the syllabus. So that's one example. I also do a game when we're talking about leadership, and we talk about rotating leadership. So being a member of a team that has emergence of different leaders throughout different tasks. And so I play this game where I build a little Lego structure. It's just random. I put a bunch of pieces of Lego together. And I hide it behind a screen, and I give every team a bag that contains the Legos that are in the structure, but also some others. And so they're not necessarily going to use every piece in the bag. And then I tell them that one person per team is going to come up, and they have 10 seconds to look at the structure behind the screen. And then they go back to their teams, and they have to instruct their team on how to build it. And they may not put their hands on it. And so they come, they take a snap, they look at the stuff behind the screen, they go back, and they start instructing the team how to build it. And then a few minutes later, it's okay, send another person up. They get to do the same thing, and then they can't touch it, and the first person is allowed to touch. So what it does is we do multiple iterations until finally a team gets the structure correctly. It's remarkably hard. There's only about 10 pieces in the structure, but it is remarkably hard because what we find, and part of the debrief, is that every leader's got a different style of communicating. Everyone that comes sees the structure differently, because maybe they pop their head around one way and then they pop the other. And so it's a three-dimensional thing, and having to describe that in all three dimensions can be very challenging. And then they have to, also they have to adjust their listening every time to the different person who's coming back. So it's all kinds of leader follower dyad stuff that's really interesting. And generally a lot of really interesting things happen. Some people are really good at going and seeing it with their eyes and then coming back and communicating. Other people are not as good. And so we sort of explore that. And is the failure in their ability to memorize what they're seeing? Is it a spatial thing, or is it their communication? Because maybe they see it, but they don't know how to describe it to someone if they can't touch it. So really fun game. Students get a lot out of it. It's very rowdy, lots of physicality, again, of movement and that type of thing. And lots of great debrief notes. Okay, another one a colleague of mine does is he uses Monopoly in his finance class, and he uses it to, it's an abridged version of the game. And my understanding is that he uses it to show how firms move in relation to each other. I don't even know, but all I know is that I hear every year about this fantastic Monopoly game that they use for finance. And I think he got it from the internet. Again, a lot of this stuff you can either Google, or you can use chat and or some AI and get ideas, and then just refine to meet your learning objectives as needed. Ethics, I've heard the use of the Tragedy of the Commons simulation. That's really great. You break people into teams and they all have to compete. And the interesting ethical dynamics that come up in that simulation actually could apply in more than just ethical situations. It could be in game theory, strategy, other courses too. For a client, we built a game. We actually did it with cards, like just little pieces, slips of paper, and maneuvering around, but I've actually subsequently built it into simulation software. But we actually built a simulation of decisions around building a community pool, and how to make sure that those maximize inclusiveness, but also factor in the power interest grid. So making sure that, just because somebody's powerful doesn't mean that their interests that they have high interest and that they don't get their voice overheard in comparison to somebody who has high interest, but maybe a lot less power. So I do a lot of those types of things. Oftentimes I'll start with the learning objectives, and then from the learning objectives, think about, well, what's a way that I could showcase this or get the students to perform these behaviors or practice these behaviors or think through this type of thing. And then I'll think about, designing the game around that and about what the learning outcomes can be. Some other engaging activities that I use all the time, role playing, where people have to take on a role in something. You can use the 6 thinking hats framework, where everybody's role is defined by the color of their hat. And or you could, I've done this where I give them a negotiation style or an influence tactic that they have to use, and they have to stick to that and stay in character. And so then I'll put them into a situation where they're trying to influence someone, and they're competing with people who are using maybe other influence tactics to try to see which ones are most effective in that situation and why. That one is usually pretty fun, although can be a little frustrating for students because they don't like to stay in their role. So whenever you do role playing, really important to give them time to practice and to encourage them, as the facilitator, as you're walking around, to make sure they stay in role. Case studies, we do case studies all the time. Students are increasingly resistant to reading long case studies that are involved. So oftentimes I'll break up the text into different boxes, more like a newspaper or a magazine, to try to give them different things to look at and cut down on the time it takes for them to prepare for the actual discussion. But I've pulled stuff from the news, I've made stuff up myself. And also Harvard Business Review Publishing. You can log in as an educator, and you have access to just a ton of different case studies. They also, by the way, have games and simulations and things too that you can look through their catalog. They can be pricey, but if your institution pays for that type of thing, or if you're able to if you have a small class, you may be able to afford a class set. But yeah, lots of opportunities for case studies. They're all over the internet. And, again, AI can help you make up case studies that exactly showcase the things that you're looking to showcase. I've done class debates. So one famous one that I do every semester when we're talking about pay equity is the FIFA versus the women's national soccer team of the United States. And when they said that when the women's team sued FIFA saying that the men were paid more, but the women had a better record. And so what I do in that case is I actually assign, usually all the boys are sitting together and all the girls are sitting together. So I make the boys be the women and I make the girls be FIFA in that situation. And we still get the arguments about, the women don't make as much in terms of advertising dollars and things like that. But it really forces them to not only debate the facts of the case, which is what I really want them to do, is to think of the standard of pay equity, but also to do a little bit of perspective taking, like putting yourself in someone else's shoes, even if you don't necessarily agree with it. So that's generally interesting. And then I get them to vote at the end about which side actually had the more compelling argument. So yeah, and I mentioned online simulations. So there are lots of catalogs. I use the Harvard Business Publishing ones a lot. There's one, for example, that's building a coffee shop. I use it in my strategic management class because it talks about some of the low-level decisions when you're a small player in a local market, and then what happens when you regionalize, and then what happens when you go global and you decide to vertically integrate and things like that. And so it's got a lot of great concepts that we've been talking about in class, and it gives them an opportunity to, practice it in kind of a real world thing. And every student knows what a coffee shop is, so it's easy for them to understand and to put themselves in the position of somebody who was thinking like that. All right, breakout groups. So breakout groups, very, very helpful. Mixing them up is helpful. You know, I do a lot of activities with a set team for students every semester, but I also try as much as possible to mix them up as well, just so that they get to know different people and have different dynamics at play. A variation on this is the pair share. So just putting them in pairs to have conversations. You know, you're not going to have every group report out in that case, but you know, so it's better for something where they're practicing, and it's okay if you don't debrief every single group, versus if you really do need to see what every single group's going to do, then you want to keep them in larger groups, obviously. Speed dating is another one. So this is when you pair them up to achieve a task or to do something, and then you have a timer, and as soon as the timer goes, they have to switch partners and, you know, rotate around. That's usually super fun. Again, some of the characteristics of this are they're engaging, motivation, you know, it's fun. There's that fun aspect, and there's the physicality of just moving, you know, getting them moving out of their seats. Having peers teach sections of the class. So this is an activity that can be really helpful for cementing learning, because, you know, you often think you know something until you have to teach it, right? And so giving the students topics that they then teach to the rest of the class or become little mini experts on, first of all, it's very empowering for them because they feel like, wow, there's something I've got mastery over. This is great. And then being able to be the expert and share it with their peers is a great way to do it. And as students, you know, transition from children to adults, giving them more control over their own learning and having them teach each other is just a really powerful way to help with that transition and take you out of the equation. Because at the end of the day, you know, 35 eyeballs on you all the time is not the best way for them to learn. They learn just as much, if not more, from each other, from how their peers you know, frame something, and you'll learn something because they will teach it in a way that always will teach you something. You know, it's always bringing a different perspective. So, all right. So fun things like storyboarding or you know, enacting a little skit or shooting a video, you know, that tends to get students engaged. So I will send them out to do a little training vignette, or for my, you know, OB class, or I'll have them, you know, again, if they're going to teach somebody something, have them shoot a video, because then they work together. It's, again, fun and active. It's a different medium, and it brings in creativity. So anything that brings in kind of their artistic side is kind of tapping a different part of the brain. And there's, again, research that shows when you use creativity and mix that with, you know, sort of the scientific brain or the other side of the brain, it actually helps them learn more and more quickly. So drawing, you know, so for example, I do this design thinking sprint, but instead of having them write down a lot of words in the sprint, so, you know, it has a little framework and they have to gain empathy and then they have to prototype and everything else, I force them to draw only pictures, so that they have to listen to somebody, and they have to visualize what this person is saying to them and what they really mean, and really try to get underneath their needs. And they need to draw that. And then once they've drawn their needs, they then have to prototype, you know, a product that is going to meet their needs. And I make them draw it, no words. So that's usually really fun. It's very challenging, but it taps that artistic side. And that is done under a time constraint too. And so you'll get, you know, some kiddos are like drawing at the very, you know, highly detailed level, and others are very conceptual. And so that's really interesting too. And you can kind of lean into that in your debrief as to why somebody, you know, felt they needed every detail, and was that helpful in, you know, ultimately getting to more creative ideas for their products or a better product. And then, you know, obviously sometimes you're going to be teaching in an online environment. So, you know, a couple of tips and tricks there. You know, obviously you can still use breakout groups, and in many cases you could still use an online simulation or some of these other tactics. You know, there's whiteboards, so having them participate in writing on the whiteboards, things like Miro or Padlet, you know, is a great one where people can put something up and then they can interact with it, and it's all very visual in those spaces. You can do polls. One thing that I learned from a colleague that I thought was really fun was when uh, when you are trying to sort of pull the room or see how what a particular sentiment is around a particular topic or whatever, she gets everyone to just type what they're thinking or a question or one word into the chat, but not hit send, and then wait and then have everyone send it at the same time. And it's generally very interesting to see all the different responses. And then again, people are reading each other's responses. And so that can just be a really interesting device as well. So overall, lots of different avenues you can go down. Hopefully this has sparked some great ideas for you. And hopefully you can use a lot more games and activities in your teaching. So thanks for listening and good luck.